I poisoned my fiancé with antifreeze the day we were supposed to become millionaires. I remember standing in the parking lot watching them load Steve into the ambulance and thinking, I need to cry harder. I need to look more scared. So I did. I turned it up. I grabbed the sleeve of whoever was standing closest to me. I made the sounds a woman is supposed to make when her fiancé is being wheeled away on a stretcher. And the whole time, underneath all of it, I was doing math in my head. $37 million. That's what was waiting for us. $37 million. And I had just made sure that the only other person who was supposed to get it, the only person whose name was on that paperwork, was never going to sign anything ever again. That was the plan. That was my plan. And for about 48 hours, I actually thought it was going to work. Let me tell you how a person ends up here, how a person goes from struggling, from scraping, from fighting with the water company over a bill you can't pay, to standing in a parking lot watching the man you've spent 13 years with get loaded into a helicopter, knowing that you're the reason he's in there. It doesn't happen all at once. That's what I need you to understand. It creeps. I met Steve at a shelter in Washington. That sounds bad when I say it out loud, but that's where we were. Both of us. Both at the bottom. Both looking for something solid to hold on to. And Steve was solid. Big guy. Tall. The kind of man that makes you feel like nothing can get through him. Like he was built to absorb whatever the world threw at you both. For a while, that's exactly what he was. We moved around a lot over the years, ended up in an apartment complex that I can only describe as the place you land when you've run out of better options. The neighbors were loud. The walls were thin. We fought about money constantly. Not because we hated each other, but because there was never enough of it and we were both exhausted from pretending there would be someday. Steve had his problems. I'm not going to sit here and pretend he didn't. The drinking was bad some stretches. The drugs were worse in others. I loved him through all of it. I want to make sure that comes across. I genuinely loved Steve Riley for a long time. But love changes when you've been poor long enough. It calcifies. It gets brittle. And then one day, you look at the man across from you and you stop seeing the future and you start seeing the wait. That's where things were between us when Marcus Riley first made contact. 1. Steve got a call from a friend who said there was a man asking about him, trying to track him down, said he was family. A long-lost uncle from Ireland, a man named Marcus Riley who had apparently been searching for his nephew for years. When Steve told me about it, I remember my first thought was, scam. I said it out loud. I said, Steve, this is a scam. People don't just show up out of nowhere claiming to be your long-lost Irish uncle with money. But Steve wanted to believe it, and I think I understood that. When you've been scraping for years, when you've watched other people get lucky over and over again, and you're still in the same apartment counting quarters, you want the miracle story to be yours. You want it to be real so badly that you start making room for it in your brain like it's already happened. So he wrote back, and Marcus Riley wrote again. And the story kept growing. Steve's uncle had done well in Ireland. Made money. When he passed away, he left everything to his nephew, and the sum of money that was coming after properties were sold off and accounts were liquidated was over $37 million. $37 million. I want you to sit with that number for a second. Really sit with it. Not 37,000, not 300,000. 37 million. And it was just waiting. Just sitting there in Ireland in the hands of a lawyer named Harrison who was going to fly over and hand us the paperwork and change everything. Steve believed every word of it. And here's my terrible secret. So did I. For a long time, so did I. 4 months before everything fell apart, we learned that Marcus had died, and the lawyer, Harrison, contacted Steve to let him know the inheritance was now ready to be processed. The original $17 million had grown. Property sales, investments. The final number was $37 million. I'm going to tell you something I haven't told anyone. The night Steve told me that number, $37 million, I laid awake until 4 a.m. crying. Not from sadness. From relief, from the feeling of being able to exhale after holding your breath for so long that you forgot you were doing it. I could feel the apartment walls pulling back. I could see Ireland. Castles, Steve had said. We're going to live like we're in castles. I believed him. For a few months, I believed all of it. And then things started to shift. Rebecca, our nosy neighbor, always poking her head in, always finding a reason to knock on our door. She let something slip one afternoon. Something Steve had told her in what was supposed to be confidence. He was going to leave me. Not just leave me. He was going to take the inheritance, take the $37 million and go. Back to California, maybe. Or Ireland. He'd changed his will, apparently. The money was going to his son, Ryan. Not to me. I'm sure you can imagine what that felt like. Standing in that apartment that smelled like mildew with an overdue electric bill on the counter, having just spent the last several years counting down the days to the moment everything was going to change. And finding out that the man you'd been waiting alongside was already planning his exit without you. I don't remember exactly how I felt in that moment. Numb, I think. The way a bruise doesn't hurt until you press on it. I pressed on it constantly after that. Every day. rolling it around in my head, going back through our conversations and looking for the moment he'd made this decision, trying to figure out if I could change it, trying to figure out if I had any options at all. And then one night, alone, while Steve was in the garage working on his truck, I started turning over a different kind of thought. What if he didn't make it to the signing? I want to be careful here about what I say and what I don't say. What I will tell you is that antifreeze contains ethylene glycol. And ethylene glycol, when it's mixed into something sweet, iced tea, for example, doesn't taste like much at all. It's sweet, sweeter than you'd expect something toxic to be. Steve loved my iced tea. I made it exactly the way he liked it. The morning of the signing, I made his tea. I remember being very calm about it. That's the part that scared me about myself later when I had time to think about it. How calm I was. Like I had simply made a decision and now I was executing it. The way you'd fix a leaking pipe. Practical. Methodical. Steve drank his tea. He was out in the garage most of the morning, working on his truck with the windows closed and barely any water. That part was real. He was spray painting the doors and it was warm, and I thought it would make sense later as an explanation. Heat stroke. Dehydration. A man who'd been drinking beer all day in a closed garage. I started building the story before the story needed to be told. By the time we got to the airport to meet Harrison, the lawyer who was flying in with the paperwork, Steve was already feeling off, dizzy, nauseous. He threw up in the airport bathroom. His heart was doing things hearts don't do. Wes, our friend, took him home. I stayed at the airport waiting for a lawyer who was never going to show up. That part I didn't know yet. That part surprised me. I sat in that airport for 2 hours waiting for Harrison from London and his briefcase full of paperwork, and he never walked through those doors. His emails, when people tried to trace them later, came back undeliverable. The phone number for his office didn't connect to anything real. $37 million that was never there. I had poisoned my fiancé for money that didn't exist. I found that out sitting in a plastic chair in an airport, watching travelers move past me with their luggage, and I couldn't tell you what that felt like because there isn't a word for it. It was like the floor dropped out of a building you were already falling through. When I got home, Steve was in bad shape. I told myself I could still fix it. I told myself I could call for help, and maybe they could do something, and maybe it wasn't too bad yet, and maybe... But I didn't call. Not that night. In the morning, when he stopped responding to his name, when he wouldn't open his eyes, I called 911. The officers were kind to me at first. They always are in the beginning. I was the grieving fiancé. I was the woman who'd called for help. I was crying. I was doing all the right things. What I didn't realize was how many people in that apartment complex had been watching us for years. Billy Burkhead, Steve's friend, our neighbor. Billy had been watching. Billy had been paying attention to things I said in arguments. Billy's wife, Lynn, had heard me say something once. Something I'd said offhandedly in a moment of frustration years ago about how if I ever needed to get rid of a partner, I'd use antifreeze because it was sweet and hard to detect. I honestly don't remember saying that. I don't remember that specific moment. But I believe I said it. I believe it because it sounds like the kind of dark, ugly thing that comes out of your mouth when you're exhausted and you're fighting and you're just trying to win the argument. I didn't mean it when I said it. And then years later, I did. Billy called the officers back to the apartment the day after Steve died. He sat down with them and told them I had poisoned Steve. He said it plainly, the way only someone who already knows the truth can say it. I overheard him through the wall, and I went out there. I called the neighbors nasty people. I deflected. I did what I'd always done in moments of pressure, which was to fill the space with enough noise that nobody could hear the quiet thing underneath. It didn't work this time. The toxicology report came back. Ethylene glycol. Toxic levels in Steve's bloodstream. No alcohol. Despite what I'd told the paramedics about him drinking all morning, the blood test didn't lie. I started getting a feeling in my chest around this time. A low, steady pressure, like something was tightening. I talked too much. I kept coming back to the inheritance, even in the middle of a conversation about my dead fiancé. I couldn't help it. The $37 million was like a phantom limb. I could still feel it there, even though it was gone. I kept reaching for it in my sentences. Detectives noticed things like that. They brought in Rebecca. They brought in Ryan, Steve's son, who had flown in. They sat Ryan down and explained to him, carefully, that the inheritance he'd come to understand was coming. The money his father had spent years patiently waiting on was a scam, a fraud. Someone had manufactured a dead uncle and a London lawyer and $37 million and used it to string Steve along for 6 years. When I heard about that later, what they'd told Ryan, I sat down and I couldn't get up for a while. 6 years. Steve had spent 6 years of his life waiting for something that was never going to come. 6 years of holding on, of tolerating the apartment and the poverty and the problems, because on the other side of all of it was Ireland and castles and $37 million. And it was all invented. He died chasing a ghost, and I helped. When they finally sat me down for the real interrogation, not the early conversations where they were kind and careful, but the actual room, the actual detectives, the actual recordings, I thought I was ready. I had been rehearsing. I had gone through every question I could imagine and worked out the answers. I knew my timeline. I knew my story. I knew how to look sad and confused and cooperative without giving them anything real. But the problem with lying to experienced investigators is that they already know the answers to most of the questions they're asking, and they showed me the inconsistencies between what I'd told the paramedics and what I was telling them now. The body cam footage from the night before Steve died, when I'd bragged to the officers about the inheritance and how we were going to pay off all our bills. The timestamps that showed Steve hadn't been at a walk-in clinic. The blood test that showed no alcohol, not a drop, despite my story about him drinking all morning. Every time they caught me in a contradiction, I felt the room shrink a little. I held on longer than I probably should have. I pointed at Billy. I pointed at the neighbors. I implied that anyone could have gotten into our apartment, that there were people who hated us, that Steve had his own reasons for maybe doing what was done to himself. None of it landed. I could see it not landing. At some point I asked if I was being arrested. They said no, just talking. I asked for a lawyer. And the second I said those words, I saw something shift in the detective's expression. Not surprise, more like, there it is. They walked me out. I said things in the way that I shouldn't have said. I said if I was going to unalive him, I would have done it the day he lied to me, and I would have done it differently. I don't know why I said that. The pressure does things to you. The search warrant found the Windex bottle in the apartment, green liquid inside, and no cap. They found the Coors Light bottle in the garage, the same garage where Steve had spent all morning working on his truck, sweating, drinking what he thought was beer. What he was actually drinking, what I had put there for him to find, was antifreeze mixed into the bottle. Sweet, undetectable by taste. A closed garage and a warm morning provided everything else the story needed. I was arrested on October 30th, 2024. I remember asking them to lock up the apartment so the dogs wouldn't be left inside. That's what I was thinking about in that moment. The dogs. I told them I'd never done anything wrong. I told them I was a scapegoat. I told them that if I was going to do something like this, I wouldn't have done it this way. I kept talking all the way to the car. I think some part of me believed that if I talked long enough, the right combination of words would unlock something, would make them see it differently, would buy me one more hour, one more story, one more chance to adjust the narrative. But you can't adjust the toxicology report. You can't adjust the Coors Light bottle. You can't adjust 13 years of an apartment full of people who watched you and listened to you and remembered the things you said when you thought nobody was paying attention. 6 months after my arrest, I sat in a courtroom and accepted a plea deal. I pled guilty to the murder of Steve Riley. I was sentenced to life in prison. My first chance at parole won't come until 2050. I think about Steve sometimes. I think about the morning he woke up and went out to work on his truck and drank what I'd left for him and felt the warmth of what he thought was a regular day. Counting down the hours to the airport, to the lawyer, to the paperwork and the castles and the life he'd been promised, he died believing, right up until the end, that the inheritance was real. In a way, that's the cruelest thing about any of this. He never found out it was a lie. I did that much for him. He went without knowing. I don't know if that makes it better or worse. I honestly don't.